Are you confused by all this stuff on the internet about what energy systems are, bioenergetics, use of fat, carbohydrates? Oh, you just need to do a keto diet to increase your body's ability to burn fat. Is any of that remotely true? And perhaps the old model of how this is taught may not be entirely correct. This is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. I have a PhD in exercise physiology and metabolism. My goal here is to explain to you a new way of looking at energy systems, although I'll put new in quotes. The classic sort of energy system, which is not 100% wrong, says that 1 to 12 seconds equals your creatine phosphate system. And then we've got our 12 seconds to 120 seconds, or maybe 2 minutes or longer. And this is your use of carbohydrates at that point. And then as you go longer, you're going to increase your body's ability to use fat as the main fuel source. And I've actually written about this. You can find this in most classic textbooks. The thought process here is that this earlier work is what they call anaerobic, meaning that the use of oxygen not needed. And that's correct. But what really screwed me up in this was probably about 6 years ago now. I saw a demo of the Moxie sensor. So real simply, Moxie sensor is just a sensor you put over the muscle, and it determines on that muscular level, say on your quad doing some rowing, how much oxygen you're using. And the demo I saw was something they call a wind gate. So 30 seconds, balls out, intensity. So usually with something relatively short, we would say oxygen isn't really used much at all. But on the sensor, what I saw was they started out at 85% what's called saturation, or SMO2. That just means that the muscle has a huge amount of oxygen there, and it's not really using much oxygen. What I saw on the sensor was literally at the end of the 30 seconds, the muscle was down to about 10%. And this started dropping almost immediately. And in plain English, what this means is that even during very short outputs, your body is using a ton of oxygen. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought short exercise bouts were anaerobic and that later we transitioned. What it turns out is most everything is based on the rate of oxygen use. And there is a little bit of a delay if you're going super hard for maybe 100 meter, but you're still going to be using a lot of oxygen after. So again, my bias is I don't really think there is much anaerobic exercise. So if none of this made sense, let's back up all the way and explain this a different way. This is something called the classic crossover effect. Crossover effect was formerly demonstrated by Brooks and Mercier about 1994 actually. And here is our chart. And we're going to say across the bottom is power. They used aerobic power. And in English, if we want to just use intensity, that works good enough. On the right-hand side of the graph, really high intensity. On this end of the spectrum, low to non-existent. Rest and balls out. Super high intensity on the other end. And on the one side of the graph, we'll look at percentages of fuel used. I just put percentages. Now, what we find is We'll put our marker here, 100, our marker here as rest, just so it's a little easier to see. Now, the two main fuels are going to be fats and carbohydrate. So for carbohydrate, we'll use a red line. And at rest, it's going to be really low. And then as we get up to high intensity, we're going to be using almost 100% carbohydrates. It turns out, as you can guess, fat has the inverse relationship. Fat's going to start up here real high, and then it's going to plummet as we get closer to high intensity. So this percentage of fat used here at rest, again, it is variable. That's a little training for another day. But even in most people, we're using a high percentage of fat at rest. And as we increase our power or our intensity, the amount of fat we use drops and the amount of carbohydrates we use increases. The point at which these two quote unquote cross over, hence the name, the crossover effect. This is your 50-50 point, where you're using 50% fat and 50% carbohydrates. So the big key here is that think of fats and carb use as dimmer switches. So these are like dials that you're going to turn to a different percentage. And both of these are being used almost all the time. Now, the percentage of what they're being used is going to be different. So you have all the biological, bioenergetic processes to run fat, which is classically called aerobic. You have all the bioenergetic processes to use carbohydrates, and they're like a DJ trying to spin two different turntables. Probably old enough, no one really remembers records anymore. So you've got one record here on the left side, record here on the right side, and you can mix them back and forth. So for a record example, as we're increasing intensity, we're moving the slider switch on our turntable further to the right. We're going to use that carbohydrate record more. And eventually, when we get to high enough intensity, we are 100% carbohydrates. So to me, this is a better way and a correct way of thinking about individual use of fat and carbohydrate. Now, in the background of all of this, we are actually primarily using oxygen. It's just at different rates. And as you get to really high intensity, that rate of oxygen use is going to be a little bit more delayed, or what they call a time lag feature. This is why you can run a 100-meter sprint, not necessarily be out of breath during the event, but your breathing is still going to be increased after it. So our two main fuel sources here are fats and carbohydrates. And as you can tell from this graph, you really want to be able to use both. This is why I like the concept of metabolic flexibility. How your body can use fat as an energy source, how your body can use carbohydrates, and like our turntable here, we can alternate the usage of fat and carbohydrates. The 50-50 point is where we're using 50% fat and 50% carbohydrates. Now, there's a couple gotchas with this. So like all things, there's a pro and a con to both fuels. Again, my bias, because my research is in metabolic flexibility, you want to be able to use fat as an energy source. You want to be able to use carbohydrates as an energy source. The question just depends on what are you doing at that time. If we take an extreme example where you can only use fat for fuel, so let's say we block the use of carbohydrates as a fuel. This does show up in a few genetic diseases. One of them is called McArdle's disease, where they lack the enzyme to break down stored carbohydrate or stored muscle glycogen. What we find is if you only use fat as a fuel source, you can just follow this graph here. You got rid of the ability to use carbs. So at real high intensities, even up past 50%, your exercise performance is going to be really crappy. What they find is when they put McArdle's patients on a treadmill, even moderately high levels of exercise, they are severely impaired. So for high intensity exercise, using the ability to use carbs or using carbs, great thing. Definitely want that. Now, if you only used carbohydrates as a fuel, you can actually do pretty okay. But I think you're costing yourself the use of fat at lower intensities. So fat, the pro is it is much, much more efficient in terms of what we call ATP, or the cellular currency your body runs on. From the exact same amount of fat, you can get a piss ton more ATP, probably up to almost 10 times the amount at least. Again, depends on bioenergetics. I'm not going to go into the exact numbers that are being used, but you get a huge amount more ATP than you do with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are less efficient at providing ATP or energy for the exact same amount of substrate or material that you start with. So if you had 100 grams of fat, 100 grams of carbohydrates, you would get way more ATP from that 100 grams of fat. Now, again, these are all trade-offs. So you're like, oh, okay, that's great. So why don't we just run almost all of our body off of fat? Well, as we mentioned in that case, when you do that, you're stuck with this curve here, and you become very intolerant of high intensity exercise. And a lot of times when you do higher intensity exercise, not only does your performance go down, you feel like absolute dog crap. Not good. Again, why would we only use carbohydrates? It's just not very efficient. We're not getting a lot of ATP, cellular energy, for it. Now, the big kicker with all of this that makes it harder to understand is something called rate. When you're using fat to get energy, the downside is it's a relatively slow process. You can get a lot of ATP, but you need time in order to do that, which is why on this graph, you've got low intensity. You have plenty of time to get that ATP. However, when you go to higher intensity exercise, the benefit of carbohydrates is you can get that ATP fast. The downside is you get a lot less of them produced. So on this graph on the right-hand side, during high intensity energy, your muscles are using a lot of energy. Blood flow is just zooming by, and you need ATP as soon as possible. So you don't have time to wait around. If you're waiting around for ATP, what is, if you look more back at our fat metabolism here, you're compromised at higher intensity. So fat is a benefit at lower intensity because we can generate a lot more ATP. Carbohydrates are a benefit at faster rates or higher intensity exercise, but the trade-off there is you're getting less ATP. And in the background, one of the main determinants of this is the rate at which you're using oxygen. Now, the other downside is at carbohydrate use, a consequence of this fast creation of ATP is we spin off some other products at that time. So these products are what's classically called lactic acid. Lactic acid gets broken up almost immediately to lactate and hydrogen ions. it turns out that lactate is actually a really good high intensity fuel. Your brain loves using lactate. Your muscles love using lactate. Cardiac system prefers lactate over almost anything else. The bugger is that these hydrogen ions are being generated at the same time. So a consequence or a con of the production of fast energy is these lactate and these hydrogen ions. So lactate isn't really the bad guy, it's actually a good guy. But when you produce lactic acid, which is lactate and hydrogen ions, these hydrogen ions come along for the ride. And these are literally an acid, not like an acid like fun LSD or anything else. An acid where you are changing the environment of the muscle. You ever had that burning sensation when you're doing like high intensity or huge 30 rep leg extensions? That is literally hydrogen ions that are being dumped into the muscle. Why? Because your body's using primarily carbohydrates. It needs ATP to be generated fast. And a byproduct of that process is lactate plus hydrogen ions. Now, in a perfect world, if we could just only get lactate by itself, that would be pretty cool. But the body doesn't really work that way. So along for the ride is hydrogen ions. So think of this as you're taking out a loan from your credit card. Hey, this is cool. I got money. Yay. And it took a couple minutes. Uh-oh. The downside is I also have this stupid high interest rate that I will need to pay back. So lactate is, yay, we got money. Interest rate is the hydrogen ions. They can't really get around it. Can't really call your credit card company and be like, yo, bro, give me a bunch of money. And then, yeah, can I get it like for no interest? No, good luck with all that. So the hydrogen ions then cause that muscle burning sensation. And they actually can impair the actin and myosin cross bridging, which is why if you've ever done leg extensions for high reps, you can't do them for thousands of reps. The burning sensation literally starts to shut down muscle contraction. So if we go back and we review real quick what any of this mumbo jumbo means in English, for energy systems, my bias is that almost all of it is based on the rate of oxygen being used. I think this is a more accurate way based on some new science of looking at it. Again, this kind of blew my mind looking at a Moxie sensor, someone doing a Wingate high intensity exercise for 30 seconds. This would be classically your easy or anaerobic, or what some people might call glycolytic. And to see O2 sats just literally start dropping immediately, which tells me that the body is literally using oxygen right away for the initial, quote, anaerobic part. And when you think about all of this, think of these as more dimmer switches and dials. Classically, how we've been taught and how I was taught was that these are more on and off switches. That's really not true. They're all more like the DJ turntables. What rate or how much of this side versus that side are we getting? The idea of metabolic flexibility is we want the ability to use as much fat as possible when needed for lower level exercise intensity or at rest. However, we still want the ability to use carbohydrates because we want high intensity exercise performance. If we can't use those carbohydrates, such as in the case of McArdle's disease, we are going to be very intolerant of higher intensity exercise, and we are going to feel like dog crap. Like all things, there's a pro and con to each one. Fat is great because we get a piss ton of ATP, cellular energy. Yay! The downside with fat is it is slow. If we only were dependent upon fat, our exercise performance at high intensity would suck moose balls. because we need energy fast. But the body is designed in a cool way. So we have carbohydrates to use to produce ATP much faster. So when time is limited, the gotcha is that we don't produce as much ATP at that point. However, the other gotcha is that we produce lactic acid, which is dissociated into lactate and hydrogen ions. So when you do high intensity exercise and you're using carbohydrates, that burning sensation you feel in the muscle is literally the production of hydrogen ions, literally an acid that is being dumped into the muscle that can then impair the cross bridges, actin and myosin. So, literally, the physical component of muscle contraction. All of this is dependent upon the rate of oxygen that you are using. So, as you use higher and higher amounts of oxygen, you're actually a little bit more on this carbohydrate end of the spectrum. Now, it is true if you do super high intensity exercise, let's say for 10 seconds, you're still using oxygen, but you run into what's called a phase delay or just a simple delay. This would allow you to run 100 meters, but afterwards, you're still going to be breathing relatively fast. You can't get away from the fact that oxygen, in some form, at some point, is going to be the main thing that your body needs in order to produce energy. Now, again, I skipped over a lot of subtopics here, but the key takeaway is that when we're looking at a modern view of energy systems, I think it's best to look at it as it is based on oxygen. And the two main fuels are fats and carbohydrates, and they each have their pros and their cons. So, my bias, the best way via metabolic flexibility, use fat for lower levels of intensity. Still want to use carbohydrates for higher intensity levels in order to preserve exercise performance and be able to switch back and forth as needed. So there you go. I hope that was helpful for you. A more somewhat modern view of energy systems in about 20 minutes.